Welcome to another little post-processing tutorial. In the last tutorials I showed you how to balance an image in terms of proportions, so doing selective transformations. Then I showed you how to balance it in terms of color balance and also for brightness. And now in this video, to follow up on this, I want to talk about saturation and how to balance the saturation in an image and to make sure that the image looks colorful, but it's not over the edge. And this is something which is very important for me. I like colorful images, so having beautiful blues, reds, oranges, color contrasts, all of that. But it's important to not go too far with it. So we're going to look at this image which I photographed in Hanoi in 2017, so 1 year before the Hanoi trip where I shot this vlog. Maybe you remember it. I also went back to this train street trying to photograph it because I had totally forgotten that I had an image with the actual train coming around the corner already. So I knew I was there again a year ago, but I didn't remember taking this photo here, which looked very nice. So now I processed it, and yeah, there are a lot of colors in this image, a lot of different colors. We have reds, yellows, greens, blues, and yeah, I did a lot of work on this image to make sure that those colors harmonize with each other. So let's first look at the raw material, or at the blended raw material. And as usual, you see that I'm starting with a fairly bright image, which is normal. I've told this in previous tutorials. I always try to expose as far to the right as possible without cutting off highlights, so I have enough details in the darkness, and then I rather darken the image in post-processing. So what now happens if you darken an image using curves or other adjustments is, if you darken areas of an image, the colors also tend to get more saturated. So making a color or an area of color darker makes it appear more saturated. So what's usual for my images is that I nearly never increase saturation during the post-processing. Because I go ahead and darken, add contrast and so on, I usually desaturate parts of the image throughout the workflow. And this is what I'm going to show you now. So I've quickly redone 2 adjustment layers here. So it's not the same steps I did to arrive at this image, but in general what I did, I used Vivisa in the first step to just darken the image and add a bit of contrast, and I didn't add any color or saturation here, but you see the before and after that, especially those reds here, the blues in the sky, also here this side of the building, you suddenly have much more saturation, and those reds here also, they're getting very oversaturated already. I also added another quick curves layer where I just darkened the image, and here I did a little selective darkening, so leaving the train and the lights a little brighter. So it's not the same I did for this here, where I did a lot of dodge and burning, a lot more color, but you get the idea. So before and after, what you see is now I have some colors which are much more saturated than in other areas, and especially this red wall here, it unbalances the image in terms of saturation, in my opinion. And now I show you a few steps or things to look out for in an image and how to fix them. So the first thing is, and I've already told this in a video which I did 2 years ago about common post-processing mistakes, is that you have to be very careful about the shadows or dark tones in the image. So in my opinion, if you work on an image and you usually have some colors in the dark areas, those are often blues, or sometimes, as in this case, down here you see you have this red or reddish cast. And if you work on an image, those colors also, as the rest, get more saturated, and I find this, this doesn't look clean if you have too much saturation in the dark tones. So what I usually do is I use a dark mask here, so I'm using Lumensia, but you could also use Tony Kuiper's Actions panel to create a luminosity mask, or do it like I explain in the Create Luminosity Masks video. So I use a dark mask here, which just selects the dark areas in the image. And then I go to the HSL, and once it finishes, I can get in with this hand tool and click here to desaturate the colors and the dark tones a bit. And you see that he selects yellows, and also he had selected the reds here. And I think especially yellows, reds and magentas are very annoying to have in the dark tones. This usually looks very unnatural also in landscape images, not only in those street images. So you have to be very careful with those colors. I think the blues are not as bad, so sometimes looks even good if you have some bluish tint in the shadows, but you also have to be careful that it doesn't oversaturate. So I usually do the same thing also sometimes for the blues. So just bringing down the blue tones a bit in the shadow areas, so to make sure that those look clean. The second step is to balance the saturation using saturation and vibrance masks. And there are a lot of tutorials. If you Google or if you look around YouTube, you find from Tony Kuiper, Greg Benz, Jimmy McIntyre, they all have tutorials about, I think, about the creation of those masks. You can use for example, this HSL, HSB slide filter. You can use the selective colors. I'm not gonna go through it. I just use Lumensia here and select the saturation mask. So what does such a mask do? The saturation mask basically selects the areas in the image which are more saturated. So the brighter an area here in this mask, the more saturated this area is. And let's quickly again use the HSL here. So this applies the mask to the HSL. Give it a bit of time. Now we have a look at the mask again. So you see here around those lights, there's a lot of saturation. This is at least what the mask's telling me. And that's true. You see, if you look here, it's very orange. Also, I'd expect those areas, those reds, to be selected a bit in the mask. And you see, yes, they are. And also around here, where we have the yellow in the picture, this is more saturated, and the sky is also a bit saturated. And yeah, that's what this mask reflects. Now, what I want to do with a saturation mask usually is I use it to reduce the saturation a bit. And I do this globally here. I could go to the extreme now just to show you. So this is a little bit too much, but you see how it balances the saturation. It takes the saturation from areas which were more saturated and leaves the areas which are less saturated. And thus it balances the saturation. But I wouldn't go that far, so I usually just go down a bit to get it a little more even in the image. And yeah, that's basically what I do with this saturation mask. What I could also do, if I find that the image also needs a little bit more saturation in other parts which are not that saturated, I would use the vibrance mask here. And this is basically the opposite. So it selects areas in the image which are less saturated. And you see here for this image, it selects quite a lot, and I could even refine it a bit so we don't get such a wide selection. Then I use the HSL again, and now here I would increase the saturation a bit. And if I go to the extremes, you see what it does. So it leaves those already saturated areas untouched, but increases the saturation on the rest. But I usually just do a little bit here. So now let's just group all those and see the before and after. So already it looks much more balanced in terms of saturation. So in the next step, I'll now do a little bit more targeted adjustments. So the settings I did now were kind of global, although I was using masks, they were done to the whole image. Now I will focus on certain areas, and I'll just let myself be guided by my eyes. So I'm just looking at the image and areas which just pop out, I go in and desaturate them a bit, and I also increase the saturation a bit on other areas, trying to balance the image. And for this I create a bunch of hue saturation layers, and for those adjustments it's now important I don't use master, so I go in and adjust the saturation for certain colors. For example, I might create an adjustment layer where I reduce the reds, -50 or -48 in this case. Now I invert the mask. I duplicate this layer, and again I go to the reds, I increase it, so going to +50 or so. And I can give those a name, so plus red, and the other one, just call it -red. And usually I do this also for the yellows, the blues. So I have all those layers in place. I can skip through them and paint in the masks. But to keep this video more brief, I'll just focus on the reds now. So with those layers in place, I now go in. I use a bright brush, so a white brush with like 20%. I go to the areas which are too red, and I use the -red, and I just paint away a little bit of the saturation. Also here, this sticks out for me, so I reduce the color. This was a bit too much, so a bit, maybe 10%. Go to this side, also remove a bit of the red, and also around this light source here. This is more yellow and orange, so I would use a HSL layer for yellow, but I'm just gonna go and do it for the reds. Remove a bit of the reds here, and yeah, let's see if we want, here for the strain I might increase the reds a bit to balance it. So also this is the focus in this image, so could use a little bit more saturation. Let's see if we have other areas. Yeah, as I said in the beginning, I find those red walls a little bit distracting, so I also reduce a bit of the saturation here, also up here, because on the other side I don't have much color to balance it, so I reduce the saturation. Yeah, now I go through the image, look at certain areas and do exactly this. And yeah, I might go in and create a HSL layer for the blues. I increase it, invert it, duplicate it, let's put it below so it's the same as the other. I reduce it, so this is the minus blue, and this here's the plus blue. And yeah, now I go in and, for example, those areas here, I don't want this bluish tint, so I just paint it out. Also here, a little less. I think you get the idea. So I now showed you 3 steps I usually use to balance saturation in an image. And those are: first, watching at the dark tones, or watching out for those saturated colors there and cleaning them up. Then using saturation and vibrance masks to balance the saturation. And finally, going into and target very specific areas, reducing and increasing the saturation to balance saturation in the whole image. So I hope you liked this little tutorial. If so, make sure to give it a thumbs up, and also don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more tutorials and also landscape photography vlogs.